Can you go over the various positions of the scholars regarding the fiqh of praying while traveling? I typically go every few weekends for work, and I want to know, traveling for work, and I want to know when am I allowed to do qasr of the salah?
وما أرسلنا من قبلك إلا رجالا نوحي إليهم فاسألوا أهل الذكر إن كنتم لا تعلمون.
So the question is about when to do qasr, and because it is such a long topic, most likely we will do this next week as well, part 2 of this. And I want to do this question actually for 2 reasons. Number 1, so that we will inshallah ta'ala know what constitutes safar, and all of us will inshallah also be able to take advantage of when can we shorten our prayers during safar. But there's also another reason, and this is a much more nuanced and academic one. The reason that I also want to discuss this is that this issue of what constitutes safar or travel is a very good case study that will make us realize and appreciate the efforts of our ulama in trying to make the sharia easy for us. That most of our ulama held a position, as we're going to explain, a particular number, 48 miles let's say. And today inshallah we will demonstrate how did they get to this number. And their attempt in getting to this number was to make life easy. If you're going 48 miles, for example, they would say it's safar, and if it's less than this, it's not. But in the process of getting 48 miles, we will demonstrate they followed a multi-step process, each one of which is very much a human ijtihadi effort. And each one of which has gray areas that they kind of just smoothed over to get to stage 2, then stage 3, then stage 4, then stage 5. And therefore, if this is a human effort, should we not go back and see in light of our circumstances what might be another number or another mechanism of deducing safar? In other words, my goal today is twofold. Number 1, to give you an answer, inshallah. That is the goal, don't worry. But number 2, in the process, to open up a very awkward door. And this door, I've been skirting it for the last 7-8 months. You've been hearing me all the time saying this. How much of our fiqhi positions do we hold fast to? And how much do we say, hold on a sec, that's not Allah's revelation, that is a human effort. Maybe we can fine-tune. And the actual answer to this question, we'll leave it to the ulama. But I wanted to present to you a case study that perhaps you can begin to appreciate. You know what? Just because a scholar said something 1,000 years ago doesn't make it the religion of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now, obviously, this opens the Pandora's box. The Pandora's box, we all know what it is. What is it? To what level are we going to change? Are you going to change everything? And understandably, those that are practicing Islam, those that are very passionate, they're comfortable with their understanding. And others come along and they say, hold on, let's fine-tune, let's change. And they're like, what are you going to do? Change everything? The haram is going to become halal? They're going to allow everything? So they want to stick to their tradition. And the problem comes, today's issue, the distance of travel, really, it's not that big of a deal. Whether you want to stick with 48 or we're going to go somewhere else, it's not going to be cataclysmic. But I wanted to use an innocent, innocuous example to illustrate sometimes, actually, changing fiqhi positions is a matter of iman and kufr. Sometimes fine-tuning will actually make Islam incredibly easier to follow within the goals of the sharia. Allah does not want to intentionally make Islam difficult. Allah does not want to intentionally make Islam difficult. وَمَا جَعَلَ عَلَيْكُمْ فِي الدِّينِ مِنْ حَرَجٍ يُرِيدُ اللَّهُ بِكُمُ الْيُسْرَ. Allah wants to make things easy. So where the sharia allows for ease, we should go towards ease. And where the sharia has a red line, we should stick with that red line. So today is a case study, not only of a very important issue that is relevant to all of us, but more important than that, to illustrate that just because 99% of the ummah said something doesn't mean it is the religion of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And we can fine tune. So let us begin. Allah says in the Quran, Surah An-Nisa, verse 101. وَلَيْسَ عَلَيْكُمْ جُنَاحٌ أَن تَقْصُرُوا الصَّلَاةِ إِنْ خِفْتُمْ أَن يَفْتِنَكُمُ الَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا لَيْسَ عَلَيْكُمْ جُنَاحٌ that there is no sin on you, that you perform qasr in your salah if you are scared that someone may harm you. Now, the verse seems to suggest that qasr is only performed when you're scared of an enemy attacking. However, by unanimous consensus, this is not a condition. Umar ibn al-Khattab, hadith is in Bukhari, said that I asked the Prophet ﷺ about this verse, that must we be in fear? And the Prophet ﷺ said, this is a rukhsa, this is a charity, a sadaqah that Allah has given you, so accept His charity. Anytime you're traveling, you can do qasr. This is, all scholars agree, there's no ikhtilaf on this issue. Qasr means you can pray 4 rak'at as 2. The 4 fard are prayed as 2 rak'at. So there is unanimous consensus that you don't have to be under threat of attack. You may do qasr anytime you travel. And you may perform your dhuhr and your asr and your isha. Instead of 4, you may pray 2. There is unanimous consent, all the scholars. Now, the ikhtilaf obviously comes over what constitutes a safar, number 1. And number 2, how long can you remain in safar once you've come to a temporary destination? In the safar itself, you can spend months. If you were to go from Morocco to Mecca, it would take 3 months in those days. You are constantly in safar as you're walking on camel, on foot, no problem. Once you get to Mecca, for how long can you remain in Mecca before you say, okay, now I have to pray full? That's the second controversy which we're not going to discuss today. Today we will discuss the distance of safar. Next week, inshallah, we'll come back and we'll discuss how long can we remain in safar and other issues pertaining to that. So, today's issue, when do you become a musafir? Is that clear? When do you become a musafir? Now, as I said, this position or this question, the vast majority of our scholars, all 4 madhabs, they followed a methodology to get to a specific answer. I will go over briefly their methodology and give you exact numbers about their methodology, but I want to point out that in reality, this topic has been the subject of many PhD dissertations in the Muslim world. More than one person has spent 4 or 5 years of his or her life compiling all of the opinions and demonstrating who said what and why did they say it. This is one of those opinions where, no exaggeration, there are over 20 opinions narrated from our classical fiqh. Over 20. One of them has become dominant, but we know over 20. In these few minutes I cannot do justice to all of them. I want to give you the methodology, and I want to explain the human element of deriving this methodology. Now, let us begin. Allah says in the Quran, the Prophet ﷺ basically said, if you are traveling, you can do qasr. This we derive from the text. Clear? If you are traveling, you can do qasr. The problem comes, the Quran and the Sunnah, or the issue comes, I should say, the Quran and the Sunnah does not define when you are a traveler. The Quran and the Sunnah does not have a revelation or a hadith that specifies when a person becomes a musafir. Therefore, the scholars of fiqh tried to get to a number and they followed methodologies. The first thing that they did, they went through the whole Quran and all of the hadith to try to find any usage of the term travel, safar, linked to any time frame or distance. Anything. So that they can derive, is there even secondary or indirect or insinuating evidence of what a travel is in the Quran and Sunnah. Okay? This is the first step that they did. Any phrase found in the prophetic hadith that mentions safar and mentions a distance or a time. even if it's not in the context of qasr, because there is no hadith in the context of qasr what constitutes safar. Is that clear? Qasr and safar, you know what it means now. So they look at other hadith. Once they find that hadith, step number 2, they translate this phrasing into an equivalent measurement that the Sahaba would have known. Step number 3, by the time they are writing books of fiqh, it's no longer times of the Sahaba. This is 400, 500, 600 Hijrah. So they're going to convert the measurement that they have derived from an indirect reference into a measurement that they are accustomed to. That's step number 3. By 500 Hijrah, 600 Hijrah, they're no longer using the measurements of the Sahaba. So whatever number they derived in step number 2 must be converted in step number 3 to something that they are accustomed to. Because realize, Islam came and with it civilization came. The prophetic era is very different than the Abbasid era. The prophetic era is simple, it is innocent. There are no 2-story, 3-story buildings. There's no library. The Arabic script is not developed. There's no paper. This is very different. By the time the fuqaha are writing, you have a civilization, you have paper, you have volumes being written, you have totally different codification is being done. So this generation of fuqaha needs to convert from units of measurements the Bedouins use, the pre-Islamic Arabs use, to units of measurements they are using in the 5th, 6th, 7th century. Then, of course, modern scholars come along and they look at the books written in the 5th, 6th century, and what must they do? Convert once again. From what? Medieval units to contemporary units. These are 4 stages. Each one of them is full of ambiguities, assumptions, vague references, and a whole spectrum of opinion. Each one of these ones, okay? And to give you one simple example, where do you get this 48 number from? So, and as I said, by the way, Ibn al-Mundhir and others, they list over 20 opinions. And by the way, even within one madhab, modern scholars, putting all of these 4 steps together, you get different outputs. When I wanted to answer the question for you guys, I literally Googled. I don't get my answers from Google, but this answer I got from Google. I literally Googled Hanafi madhab distance of travel, just to see what modern Hanafi websites are saying. And within 2 minutes, I found 3 numbers: 48 miles, 51 miles, and 64 miles, all from reputable English websites. 2 minutes. These are modern Hanafi authorities across the globe, some in South Africa, some in America, some in other places, and I found 3 numbers within one madhab. Why and how? Because of these 4 different processes that they have done. So, to give you one example of these 4 processes, and this is the most common example. The first thing was to scour the hadith and see if the Prophet ﷺ said the word travel, safar, and he has anything in there that we can latch on to and say, aha, we have a number. Okay? And they found 3 or 4 hadith. Problem is, every one of them had a different number. Khair. What did they find? They found a narration, which is in Bukhari and Muslim, narrated by Abu Hurairah and others, that our Prophet ﷺ said, it is not allowed for a woman to travel the distance of more than 3 days without a mahram. Now, this hadith, is it about qasr? Yes or no? No. Has nothing to do with qasr. What does it have to do with? Mahram travel, right? But what did I say? Step number 1, find anything that has the word travel and has some distance. Check, found. It is not allowed for a woman to travel the distance of 3 days without a mahram. The Hanafis jumped on this and they said the distance of safar is a 3-day journey. They derive from this qasr issues. Okay, now, sounds interesting. Problem comes, and Imam al-Bukhari has this chapter, and then he says, those who say the distance of safar is 3 days, he quotes this hadith. Then he says, those who say the distance of safar is 2 days, and he brings another hadith. Then he says, those who say the distance of safar is 1 day, and he brings a 3rd hadith. All 3 in Bukhari, all 3 fully authentic. The same hadith narrated by other chains It is not allowed for a woman who believes in Allah and His Messenger to travel 2 days without a mahram. So some madhab said 2 days. And the same hadith with other narrations, it is not allowed for a believing woman to travel 1 day. And so the Shafi'is and Hanbalis took the 1 day. And some of the Shafi'is took the 2 day. And the Hanafis took the 3 day. So we said all of them are trying to get a number anywhere that has the word travel in it. Okay, now this is step number 1. By and large, most Malikis and Shafi'is said 1 day, some Hanbalis said 2 day, the Hanafi said 3 day distance. Okay, now, great, excellent, that's stage 1. Stage 2, 2 day, 1 day, 3 day, what does that mean? We have to now convert this quantity to a quantity that the Sahaba would have understood. Because the language is their language. Let's say, how much would the Sahaba have traveled? Or what is the distance the Sahaba would understand? 1 day or 2 day or 3 day. And so the unit of measurement of pre-Islamic Arabia is something that was called a barid. Barid. Arabs in the audience, when I say barid, what do you think of? Postal office, the mailman. Why is this? Because when the Abbasids instituted, well, what is a barid? A barid is the distance that a horse and a rider could travel before they would have to take a break. This is actually what barid means. The average distance that a rider and an average horse would travel before they'd have to take a break. That was called a barid. Now, the Abbasids were the first to institute a postal service. The postal service wasn't for me and you. We couldn't write letters to our fiancés and loved ones. No, it was meant for government officials. So they made stations of fresh riders and horses, and the bag would come, stop at the first barid, be handed to the fresh rider and horse, go to the next barid. And so they had an efficient, the largest postal service in the world was instituted by the Abbasids and that time frame. And eventually the term barid was dropped for the distance and it was applied to the parcel and package. Hence modern Arabs have no clue that barid is a distance. All modern Arabs, they are certain, they will swear to you qasam, that barid is male. And it has nothing to do with male in classical Islam. Modern Arabs don't speak classical Arabic, they speak modern standard Arabic. So barid is now what? Male. But in pre-Islam and in early Islam, barid meant the distance. Okay, now the question is, 1 day travel, 2 day travel, 3 day travel, how many barids is it? We get 15 different opinions. How many barids is that day of travel? Some said 4 days travel, some said 4 barids, some said 5 barids. We're going to skip over all of these controversies because here we see this ambiguity. You've already started with a number, 3 day travel. You have to somehow convert that to a unit of measurement they understood. And the only measurements at that time was barid. And so they try to figure that out. Now what helps them here, some of the Sahaba and Tabi'un, they actually did have positions about barids. There's not in hadith, but some of the tabi'un, they said safar is 4 barids, safar is 5 barids. And so they do have opinions, but these opinions are not from Allah and His Messenger. They are from the second generation, maybe some might say first generation of the Sahaba, but definitely second generation. We have the first fuqaha coming along and saying, how many barids is safar? So we have this point over here. So we have this issue of barids. By and large, 4 barids, 5 barids, 8 barids, we have these opinions of safar. Jayyid. By the time the books of fiqh are being written, nobody's using barids. They're using other measurements. The next measurement that came into the time frame was farsakh. Farsakh. And I think in Urdu still, there's still the term farsakh. And in ancient English, in Charles Dickens' English, the farsakh is a league. League, not a league of nations, a league. This is a unit of measurement called a farsakh. So they needed to convert the barids into farsakh because they were using farsakhs. And again, you have this ambiguity. By and large, they agreed that 1 barid equals 4 farsakhs. Okay? By the way, again, there's 5 opinions. I'm giving you the majority one to show you how much ambiguity, how much Gray areas is being done to get to this final number, and every step has 10 opinions on it. Nonetheless, so one barid has 4 farsakhs. The first generation of, and farsakh is a Persian term, so this is now adopted by early Islam when they've conquered Iraq. They're now using farsakhs. Now, by the time later scholars come, even farsakh is gone. They move to another unit of measurement. This unit of measurement is now called mil. Mil. And mil is, of course, we will jump at the word mil because for us a mil is what? A mile. But hold on. A mile 1,000 years ago is not a mile today. And mil was a unit of measurement adopted from the Romans. Farsakh was from the Persians. Mil was a unit of measurement adopted from the Romans. And mil comes from milia, and mil in Latin, in Roman, means 1,000, as you should know. And a mil for the Romans, a milia, was 1,000 steps of the Roman soldiers. That's what they called a mil. 1,000 steps of the Roman soldiers was 1 mil. Milia, they call it milia. By the way, a step for them was what we call 2 steps. The same foot goes where it was. That's like 2 steps, that's 1 step. So 2,000 steps, but they counted as 1,000. You get the point, right? They said that is a mil. Okay? And this is called the Roman mile. Now, the Arabs took the name from the Romans, but they didn't take the same measurement. The Arab mile was shorter than the Roman mile. And I'm not joking, don't think I'm making fun of this, is the reality. They say because the Arab step was smaller than the Roman step. This is the reality, I'm not saying, and the same would go anywhere. And so the Arabs adopted a mile, and it became known as the Hashemite mile. And the Russians adopted the mile. It was called the Russian mile, the Danish mile, the Portuguese mile, the German mile. In one time frame, around 700 years ago, there were at least 15 different miles. To this day, we have something called, what other mile do we use? Kilometers, not a mile. What other mile do we use? Come on, you know this. Very good, nautical mile. We still have something called the nautical mile, which is different than the land mile. So the mile was not defined. How can it be? Because there is no international body that's going to define a unit of measurement. How can there be? Every civilization had a different understanding of what a mile is. Nonetheless, our scholars now, so look where we cut from 3 days to barids to farsakhs to miles. Each one of these conversion factors is a big gray area. There is no uniformity, there is no conformity, there is give and take. Nonetheless, we get now to the 8th century of Islam, 7th, 8th century of Islam. And now we have scholars debating what is a mil. Some classical scholars say a mil is 12,000 Arab steps, not 10,000 Roman steps. I'm not joking, I'm literally telling you, 12,000 steps. Others say that a mil is as far as the eye can see. Others say a mil is when you see a figure in the distance, you know it's a human, it's not a gazelle or a deer, but you don't know if it's male or female. This is the definition of a mile. Now, what is common in all of these definitions? They are not precise. They are not scientific. This is just an approximation as far as the eye can see. When you see that is the mil. Or you see a figure, you don't know if it's male or female, but you know it's a human. All of this is approximation, and of course it's approximation because there were no bodies that all societies agreed upon to define distances. So, point being that finally in the 16th century, to be more precise, 1593, Queen Elizabeth I came along and decided in a post-Newtonian world, or more scientific world going on, let's now define all of these terms. And so she enacted an act that was adopted by Parliament in 1593 called the Weights and Measures Acts of Parliament. This is Queen Elizabeth I. The Weights and Measurement Act of Parliament, in which the 1 mile was defined to be 5,280 feet. and the feet was also defined, and the inches were defined. And so there is now a precise, actual unit of measurement. Eventually, this converts to 1.6 kilometers. And of course, they define everything else as well. Now, let's go back and plug and chug. Plug and chug all of these four. So, some ulama said 1 day journey translates into 4 barids. 4 barids translates into 16 farsakhs. That was the 1 barid is 4 farsakhs. And an assumption was made, 1 farsakh is 3 meals. So 16 farsakh is 48, the magic 48 number. This is where it comes from. 3 different conversions based upon an ambiguous hadith that has to do with women traveling. This is where we get the magical 48 from. And of course, 48 miles transfers into 78 kilometers. Okay? And this now became the standard position of many of the madhabs. And this is the fatwa that is given to this day. And again, I say this with utmost respect. I don't mean a'udhu billah to cause doubt on all of our fiqh. And this is the conundrum, because I understand when people like me begin talking and analyzing, others get worried. Oh my God, are you going to change everything? But no, inshallah, that's not the goal. The goal is where the sharia allows for change and it makes Islam easier for us, we should take it. Under the protection of ulama. I'm not saying we go all haywire and whatnot. There are ulama always forward thinking. I'm going to be very simplistic here. And I don't mean to come off as crude. If anybody actually believes that driving the car outside of Dallas and crossing 48 miles on your car odometer converts you from muqim to musafir, then you actually believe that Queen Elizabeth I played a role in the sharia of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's as blunt as I can be. Think about what I'm saying. If you actually believe that 48 miles on your car's odometer when you leave the city makes you from muqim to musafir, one of the 7 steps that got you there, one of them is what? Queen Elizabeth's precision of 1 mile being 5,280 feet and defining this. Okay, that's just one. There's other steps, each one of which is vague and a big question mark. None of this is coming from Allah Azza wa Jal and the Messenger. Now, do I blame the scholars? A'udhu billah, no, not. Of course not. They're trying to make Islam easy. We respect them, but we acknowledge the humanity of their efforts. We separate the divine sharia from the human fiqh. That's what I'm trying to do here. We separate what Allah says. When you do safar, perform qasr, versus what our ulama, as much as we love and respect them, have derived from that. Now, all 4 madhabs have a number. The number is different based on which steps they followed and conversion factors. But the overall process is the same. These 4 steps I said, all the madhabs follow them. All 4 madhabs follow them. Now, is this the only opinion? Alhamdulillah, in this case, there is not unanimous consensus. If there were, that would actually be another issue, because unanimous consensus is an evidence and we take it. If all our scholars agree on something, then khalas, sami'na wa ata'na. But when our scholars do not agree, and ikhtilaf of the scholars is a mercy from Allah, as many of the Salaf said, ikhtilafu ummati rahmah. This is a rahmah from Allah. Just because 99% of the scholars said 48 miles or 52 miles or 72 miles, we respect them. It's not Allah's sharia. Is there other opinions? Yes. Let's go back. We said there's more than 20 opinions. One of those opinions is that, and by the way, I mean, again, before I get there, so I want to be very clear here, and I've said this many times. When I open this discussion of rethinking through the madhabs and fiqh, I am not saying a free-for-all, a'udhu billah. I am a vocal critic of what I call progressive Islam. I am a vocal critic because I think they are intellectually bankrupt. They have rejected the tradition completely. They don't care what the sharia says. The halal is what is politically correct. The halal is the flavor of the month. And the classic example which we're having the conference on is the LGBT issue. That they don't care what the sharia says. They're going to make it permissible and halal because it is what is politically correct. And we have lines that we draw. We are very clear and differentiate between what Allah Azza wa Jal has said, what the Prophet said, versus what later scholars say. And again, there are so many examples of forward thinking and whatnot. I mean, 70 years ago, when microphones were first introduced, speakers were introduced in the Muslim world, there were fatwa across the globe, in Arabia, in India, that it is haram for the khatib and the imam to use a speaker. And the salah behind somebody who uses the microphone is batil. The salah is invalid. There are fatwas like this. Because they said you must hear the voice of the khatib and of the imam directly. And if you hear the voice of the mechanical amplification, the salah is batil. What happened? And eventually you just have to move on. This is human nature. Yani when first imams came to America in the 70s and 80s, understandably they did not speak English. All the khutbahs were in Arabic and it became somewhat of the norm. I grew up in that time frame. One of the reasons I chose to go study Islam was because I didn't understand the khutbahs. Believe it or not. It actually turned out positively for me. That I don't know what my religion is. My khatibs are always, even those that tried to speak English, I couldn't understand the English, but that's another point altogether. So it was one of the motivations for me to go. I don't know what the religion says. But obviously, and there are still some masajid to this day in America, you cannot give the khutbah except in Arabic. And subhanallah, common sense says, people are coming to the masjid once a week. You have them for 25 minutes. It's the only time they hear something about Allah and His Messenger. And you're going to give it up just because once upon a time the majority, no Quran, no hadith says you must give it in Arabic. Nothing like this. In fact, the Quran says, فَاسْعَوْا إِلَى ذِكْرِ اللَّهِ. Come to what reminds you of Allah. Allah calls the khutbah what reminds you of Allah. The purpose of the khutbah is to remind you of Allah. What language should it be in? The language of the people. Yes, we don't change the language of the Quran because the Quran is kalamullah. We don't change language of the adhkar of salah because that is explicit. But the khutbah, my lectures right now, is anybody going to say, I must be speaking in Arabic to teach you Islam? Of course not. Once upon a time they did. The language of Islam must have been Arabic. Slowly but surely. Even to this day, by the way, when I begin the khutbah, sometimes I begin with English phrases, sometimes I begin with Arabic phrases. I have had one brother come to me, why don't you stick with Arabic phrases when I begin the khutbah? They say this to me. And I respect it, but this is tradition. I have 70-80% of people, they have no clue what I'm saying when I stand on the minbar. If I begin, all praises due to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala who revealed the Quran and sent us a prophet. In that praising of Allah, there's something they understand and they benefit from. And if I begin in Arabic, I am seeing 80% of them are watching their iPhone, not paying attention. They don't understand what I'm saying. Again, the goal is to teach. The goal is not. So my point is, all of these things, this tension between changing for the benefit versus sticking with tradition, we are going to grapple with this throughout our lifetimes. There will always be a spectrum. The purpose of this lecture right now is to make you understand what is going on. And to make you understand there's always going to be people in that spectrum. Anyway, back to the point of the issue of the four madhabs and whatnot. We said the four madhabs have a specific number. But there has always been a dissenting voice. From the beginning of time, certain ulama have said that the Sharia did not come with a number, so we do not make a number. This has been the position of many ulama. Ibn Hazm, Ibn Qudama, Ibn Taymiyyah wrote many pages defending this. Ibn al-Qayyim, al-San'ani, al-Shawkani. From amongst the Sahaba, one can derive this from Ibn Mas'ud. Ibn Sirin is very explicit on this point as well. And we always have a small group of, they're all independent thinkers. If you look at these names here, they're always they don't want to just follow the majority, they're independent thinkers. They're always saying that, they have always said that, listen to this now, this is the correct opinion inshallah. Safar is not defined by a number. Safar is not defined by a number. Safar is defined by a frame of mind, by a state. You don't need to check your odometer. You don't need to ask a faqih. You don't need to get a fatwa from a shaykh. You know when you're traveling by what you do to prepare for the journey. That is travel. It is irrelevant, the odometer meter. It is your frame of mind. It is what you do. It is the preparations that you take. And Ibn Taymiyyah mentions many points that prove this. Of them he says, the Prophet ﷺ did not specify any distance, so how can we specify a distance? He never said, this is when safar begins. And the hadith of the women traveling has nothing to do with qasr. It has to do with protecting the honor of women. It has nothing to do with qasr. It says a woman should not be alone. Protect her if she's going a distance. Because in those days you have bandits, this and that. She should not be alone. There should be a mahram with her. That's the goal of those hadith. To read in qasr as-salah, aslan, that's not what the hadith is meant for. Number two, he says that the Sahaba did not measure the distance the way that we do in our times. By Ibn Taymiyyah's time, the distance was measured. The Sahaba did not have signposts, 100 miles, 70 miles, 50 miles. No, if there are no signposts, how are they going to measure? Number three, he says that even within these ahadith of women, you have differences, 1 day, 2 day, 3 day. It's clear that the Prophet is not intending to define safar anyway. He's trying to protect women. So to go with this as an evidence of safar, aslan, it doesn't make sense. Number four, he says that, and this is something I'm mentioning throughout, the conversion rates, the conversions. There is no agreed upon conversion. How many barids in a day's journey? Big question mark. How many farsakhs in a barid? Another question mark. How many meals in a farsakh? Another question mark. I went over one example to get you 48. In reality, every one of them has different examples as well. The Sharia cannot be based on so much ambiguity. Too many question marks. The Sharia cannot be based upon this. Ibn Taymiyyah also points out, to put a precise measurement on travel defeats the wisdom of allowing qasr during travel. The purpose of qasr is to make life easy. If you are engrossed in how many is 48 miles and you're driving looking at 48 miles, you've defeated the purpose. Qasr is not meant to make life difficult. It's meant to make life easy. Especially in the days where you didn't have a car odometer. How would you calculate 48 miles? You would be in more tension to calculate the miles. You'd rather I'm not going to do qasr, let me just pray 4 rak'ah. That's not the goal of the Sharia, to make life so difficult. Ibn Taymiyyah says, and this is so prescient of Ibn Taymiyyah, that distances vary from culture to culture. And what 48 miles is in one city might not be in another city. I add here, cultures and technologies vary. 48 miles on a camel is 25 minutes in a car. Or less, depending on if you drive like him, then you're going to be in 10 minutes or something, It depends. 48 miles is nothing in a car. If you really wanted to get technical, a day's journey in car is not a day's journey in camel. If you really wanted to go down that route, it would be totally unfair to take 48 camel miles and apply them to 48 car miles. But nobody's going down that route. Why? Because they want to stick with tradition. The book says it, it's got to be right. And that's why I'm saying, Jazakallah khair, no. The book says it, who wrote the book? Great scholar, Jazakallah khair, may Allah give him Jannah. It's not the Sharia. 48 miles is not Allah's Sharia. It is an opinion that became popular and it became cut and paste, cut and paste, cut and paste until it becomes the norm. But I just explained to you where it came from. Too many ambiguities. And Ibn Taymiyyah himself says this. 48 miles for one civilization would be a small distance. For another would be a large distance. And I add over here as well that if you really think about it, and I taught a class in San Jose, Silicon Valley, and I mentioned this example, that imagine somebody has a plane, and they live outside the city, and they have a private jet, and they come into the city every day, and they come back, and because it's San Jose or maybe LA or whatever you want to do, they get to and from work in 10-15 minutes, whereas the guy who lives outside the city takes 2 hours by car. Okay? And the guy who lives 150 miles away takes 15 minutes. Does it make sense, any 48 miles? So somebody raises and says, Shaykh, my boss has a private jet. He lives 150 miles away, the CEO, and he flies his private, Cessna every day to work and every day back. It's a real life example. Cessnas are very, very affordable. I'm sure you'll be able to buy one soon, inshallah, once you become a medical student. $150,000, you get a Cessna, right? You can have your plane and go wherever you want. This guy has his own Cessna. He goes and comes back. Do you think, in his case, he is commuting to work? He's literally flying in 8 a.m., flying back 5 p.m. This is his daily routine. Do you think he thinks it is safar? It's faster for him to get to work than all of his employees, even though technically he lives the distance outside. This is why this whole notion of 48 miles really, and I have to be blunt here, does not make a shred of sense, especially in modern times. Safar is not defined by a mile, it is a frame of mind. You don't ask any shaykh or alim, you know when you are traveling. You know when you're traveling, you turn the thermostat down, your mail is going to be put on hold, you pack bags. You know when you're traveling. That's a frame of mind. It's not a distance. It is possible and also what this means, now the fuqaha were uncomfortable at this, but you have to give and take. The fuqaha wanted precise, 48. Because when you open this door, you get the following scenario. Two people can do the same journey. For one of them, it's safar, for the other, it's not. Give you an example. Let's say one of you has his full-time job in Detroit, let's say, okay? And your family is in Plano because you love East Plano Masjid so much, alhamdulillah. You have to live here as mashallah so many of you do, alhamdulillah. May Allah bless you all. But your work is in Detroit, okay? So you fly to Detroit. You have a house in Detroit. You psychologically, this is your weekly routine. You are totally comfortable doing this. Some people I know do this on a daily basis. They would fly to DC. When I was in another city, I found of a person that he had a government job, plenty of perks and whatnot, and he would fly to DC on the 8 a.m. flight, land in Washington Airport, Reagan Airport, right? Take a cab, 10 minutes to his work. He works in the, the complex, the Pentagon area type, not. And then he takes the plane, 4 p.m., and he's back home. Every single day, he gets a commercial, not a private. The commercial flight, he goes. The government's paying for it, why not? Family somewhere else, he's doing this. Now for this guy, going to DC every day and coming back, it's like an hour flight. So rather than take the car and live in Virginia, which is going to be an hour drive, I'd rather find cheaper housing for my family. The government's paying my... And he told me he does this. He asked me, is this safar? I said, do you feel like you're traveling? He goes, no, it's a routine. I just go. It's my daily routine. It's not safar for him. Whereas if I went to DC for a day, I can assure you that would be a travel for me. So, bottom line, Ibn Taymiyyah writes, demarcating a specific distance for safar does not have any basis in the Sharia, does not have any basis in the Arabic language, does not have any basis in common sense. This is Ibn Taymiyyah writing. To make a number is neither from the Sharia, nor from Arabic language, nor from common sense. Most people don't even know the distance of the earth, so it is not allowed to link qasr with something you don't even know. No one measured the earth in the time of the Prophet ﷺ, nor did the Prophet ﷺ say how many meals or farsakhs. And he says a beautiful point. A person might leave his village to go hunting just a short distance, but he's camping 2-3 days, and he considers it safar. And another person will go the same distance to collect wood and come back, and he doesn't consider it safar. You see, it's a beautiful point here. Somebody has to go hunt a deer. They're going to take their packing, whatnot, and they're going to be in a tent. And for them, this is safar. The same distance in Ibn Taymiyyah's time, you might have to go collect firewood, and you're going to come back, and it's not safar. His point was, safar is defined by who? By who, guys? Yourself. Mindset. If you have to ask somebody, you've lost the plot. You don't need to ask, because safar is not a distance. It is your psychological understanding. However, he did say, Ibn Taymiyyah did say, that what a regular person, a normal human being, not a crazy person, would consider safar, right? We don't want some extreme person to say, oh, my house to across the street. So no, an average intelligent human being of that society and that time frame would consider to be safar. And Ibn Taymiyyah gave an example that he lives in Damascus. He mentioned a village on the outskirts which is within 48 miles. And he said, for some people, going to that village is a safar. because it's going to take them a day to get there. And for other people who do it regularly, this is something that they don't consider to be a safar. So the bottom line, and with this we conclude part 1. We're going to come back to the travel question again next week, inshallah ta'ala. The bottom line, what distance defines safar? There is no particular distance. You, in your mindset, you have to answer to Allah in good consciousness. Oh Allah, I was doing safar, so I did qasr as-salah. If you feel that you're doing safar, and you know when you're doing safar, you pack bags, you pack something, you whatever, there are things that you do that you don't do when you go to work and you come back. That's not safar. Even if you had a private jet that comes and takes you 100 miles, it's not safar. Like the CEO, he's not gonna stop his mail or pack a suitcase or something. Not that the only issue is packing a suitcase, but that's one of the things that you do when you travel, right? There's a psychological frame of mind that comes. Bottom line, all 4 madhabs have a specific number. We saw how they got there. There has been a dissenting opinion from the beginning of time. That dissenting opinion has been a minority, but it is clearly, in my humble opinion, obviously the correct answer, and that is that safar is not a technical term. It is a term that you know, a psychological term, a term that is based on culture and custom and your own frame of mind. You have to answer to Allah, oh Allah, I was on safar and I know this is safar and I'm going to perform qasr because you allow me to perform qasr. We'll come back next week and we'll talk about how long can you remain in that destination and continue to pray. Until then, Jazakumullah khair. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
لا يزال الخير حيا لا يزال إن في الدنيا سلاما وظلال أخبر الأيام أنها في وصال قم بنا وانظر لآيات الجمال قم بنا وانظر لآيات الجمال